the farmer's daughter tying cornstalks, the welder chalking a joke on a bulkhead, the sailor sipping cocoa at midnight. Each played a role as vital as any admiral. Together they revealed the secret the Japanese sailor's diary never solved. The Essex were not just ships, they were extensions of a society mobilized to live and fight as one. And yet, the story did not end with Coco or him. Ahead lay the greatest test of all, the proving ground where these floating cities would face kamikazes, typhoons, and the desperate final gambits of an enemy unwilling to surrender. That chapter, brutal yet decisive, was still to come. In October 1944, the skies over Leyte Gulf darkened with smoke and flame. Here the Essex carriers proved their purpose beyond doubt. They launched waves of aircraft that struck Japanese battleships and cruisers before they could threaten the American landings. Navy records list over 1,500 sorties flown in a single day, an aerial storm that dwarfed anything previously attempted in the Pacific. It was the industrial crescendo, where every farm field, factory line, and shipyard spark converged in steel and fire. From the decks of USS Franklin, sailors watched as strike groups assembled overhead in perfect formation. The drone of hundreds of engines vibrated through steel beams, a living thunder that carried across the water. Japanese gunners described the sight as the sky opening. A destroyer's log written in pencil noted simply, "We do not count planes anymore. We count shadows." The Essex carriers had turned production capacity into battlefield reality. Proof that America could project power on a scale unimaginable just 2 years earlier. At Leyte, Japan's remaining carriers sailed into battle, but they were decoys empty of real striking power. Their purpose was to lure the Essex groups away. Yet American reconnaissance recognized the ruse, and Hellcats shredded the decoy squadrons. Within hours, 4 Japanese carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, were burning wrecks. Not one Essex was lost. Admiral Halsey later reflected that the decisive factor was not cunning, but endurance. We had carriers to spare. They had none. It was an abundance of strategies. In black and white photographs from that week you see the contrast. Japanese sailors exhausted, lean against listing decks, smoke curling behind them. On the American side, sailors in dungarees heave bombs across flight decks, sweat streaking faces but eyes focused as another strike lifts off. Grainy film shows Essex flight crews waving their comrades into the air. Each launch another nail in the coffin of the Imperial Navy. The onslaught did not end with Leyte. By early 1945, 17 more Essex-class carriers had joined the Pacific Fleet. Their names, Randolph, Bonhomme Richard, Ticonderoga, read like a roll call of inevitability. With them came new tactics, around-the-clock operations, massed carrier task forces, and replenishment at sea perfected to the minute. Quartermaster reports reveal that Task Force 58 consumed over 300,000 barrels of fuel in a single week, an amount greater than the entire monthly capacity of some Axis fleets. Yet the tankers and supply convoys kept pace, proving that logistics was the true general of the war. The Japanese responded with desperation. Kamikaze attacks targeted Essex decks with ferocity. On March 19, 1945, USS Franklin was struck by 2 bombs while her decks brimmed with fueled aircraft. Explosions tore through the hangars, flames reaching 40 feet high. Nearly 800 men died. And yet Franklin did not sink. Damage control teams, half blinded by smoke, dragged hoses through molten passageways, their uniforms smoldering. One chaplain stood in the open, giving last rites amid falling debris. The ship limped back to port, scarred but afloat. Her survival testified to the resilience built into every Essex hull. Other carriers endured similar ordeals. Bunker Hill, hit in May 1945, lost nearly 400 men, but still remained upright. Photographs of her burning deck show black silhouettes of sailors against towering flames, captured in harsh contrast on coarse-grained film. These images revealed the price of abundance. The Essex could not be destroyed easily, but each survival was bought with lives that would never return home. Victory was inevitable, yet it was never free. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, 24 Essex-class carriers had seen combat. Together, they launched over 170,000 sorties and supported every major amphibious operation from the Marianas to Okinawa. Their presence turned the Pacific into an American lake. Japanese officers at surrender interrogations admitted they stopped tracking carrier numbers after early 1945. One said quietly, "They appeared as clouds. We could not count clouds." The Essex fleet had grown beyond comprehension. The aftermath carried both triumph and consequence. Many Essex carriers were quickly decommissioned, tied up at anchorages like Philadelphia Navy Yard. Photographs show rows of massive hulls, silent, their decks empty, like sleeping giants. Yet others served through Korea, Vietnam, and even into the Cold War, modernized with angled decks and jet catapults. Their longevity proved that America had not only built weapons of war but foundations of post-war power. The Essex class became the bridge from piston to jet, from World War II to superpower status. Legacy lives also in the small details. A sailor remembered baking bread in a carrier galley, the smell mingling with jet fuel, a strange comfort amid chaos. Another recalled chalking a baseball score on the hangar wall the day Japan surrendered. Black and white snapshots from the time show sailors grinning, caps askew, paper streamers floating from overhead walkways. Victory was not only in grand strategy but in these fleeting moments of relief and recognition. Epilogue. The Ori Dice Essex carriers stunned Japanese sailors because they represented more than steel. They embodied a nation's will to outbuild, outlast and outfight. The riddle scrawled in that lifeboat diary, "Where do they keep coming from?" found its answer in fields, factories and shipyards where ordinary Americans labored without pause. Victory did not come from slogans or propaganda. It came from abundance, from a society that turned every rivet and every acre into momentum at sea. The Essex were not a mystery. They were America, multiplied, and their wake still ripples through history. Every 200 miles across America, plants fed the shipyards. Aluminum mills in Pennsylvania poured ingots for aircraft. Oil refineries in Texas churned out aviation fuel by the millions of barrels. A single Essex consumed 500,000 gallons of paint and lubricant before even leaving port. Yet nothing was wasted. Scraps from cut steel plates were melted back into ingots, rerouted into destroyer hulls or landing craft keels. The supply web was so efficient that by 1944, the Navy boasted a construction waste margin under 2%. By contrast, Japanese yards struggled with shortages that left half-finished hulls rusting on slips. And still the Essex carriers multiplied. Norfolk, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Newport News, and Fall River each launched new hulls in a cascade. By fall of 1944, the Navy was commissioning one every 34 days. Admiral King boasted in private memos that America now had more flight decks than the rest of the world combined. Not rhetoric, but arithmetic. Japanese intercept officers were baffled when they read decoded reports that 22 Essex were afloat. They marked the figure with question marks, unwilling to believe. The sensory overload of the shipyards mirrored the battlefront. The scent of oil, hot iron, and wet paint clung to the air. 1,000 rivet guns chattered like machine guns in unison, echoing against steel bulkheads. Newspapers called it the battle behind the battle. For every victory at sea, there was a mirrored triumph in these factories, where each workday shifted the balance of the Pacific. Mini-reveals came constantly. In September 1944, records show that USS Bennington completed sea trials just 13 months after keel laying, a record. Workers gathered on deck to sign a chalk message on the hangar bulkhead. Built in a year, victory next. A month later, USS Bonhomme. Richard joined her sisters, her hull still smelling of fresh paint when she launched aircraft into combat. Japanese prisoners who heard these timelines in interrogation sessions simply shook their heads. One muttered, "We believed America lazy. We see now they are fast giants." Human beats deepened the picture. Shipyard chaplains held Sunday prayers beside stacks of steel beams, voices echoing in half-finished hulls. Children collected scrap drives that fed furnaces. Teenagers learned to spot weld in night classes. The war was not fought by sailors alone, but by an entire nation that poured its breath into every ship. Workers wrote messages inside bulkheads. "Good luck, boys," or "come home safe," knowing no one would see them. Yet believing the words mattered. By the winter of 1944, the Essex class was not just a ship, it was an institution. Hull numbers stretched into the 70s. The Japanese could no longer track them individually. A field report from Admiral Ozawa's staff in December simply wrote, "Enemy carriers uncountable." That single word, uncountable, summed the shift of power. America had turned the Pacific into a production line. The image is haunting, a black and white photograph of welders pausing, goggles lifted, faces streaked with soot as another hull slid away down the greased ways. They smile, weary but triumphant. Those candid moments, caught on coarse-grained film, embody the answer the Japanese never truly grasped. The Essex did not emerge from mystery. They came from sweat, sparks, and a rhythm of production that no empire could match. Yet industry alone was not the full story. Behind the sparks and steel were lives lived in quiet sacrifice. Farm boys in uniform, factory girls with burn scars, sailors writing letters on the mess decks. To understand the Essex miracle, we must also step away from the steel and into the human spaces where men and women bore the war's weight. That is where our story turns next. On a rain-slicked morning in Iowa, a farmer's daughter tied bundles of corn stalks, her gloves stiff with mud. She knew the grain was bound for more than bread. Navy procurement lists show that by 1944, carriers like USS Essex consumed over 200,000 pounds of flour a month. That flour, ground and baked, traveled from Midwestern fields into mess halls afloat, feeding sailors who launched aircraft by dawn and manned gunnery stations until midnight. The war's front lines stretched invisibly into every farm furrow. On board those carriers, daily life balanced awe and monotony. Crew diaries mention chow lines like small towns, winding across decks with 1,800 men waiting for breakfast. One cook recalled cracking 3,600 eggs in a single morning. Sensory notes come through in letters home. The constant tang of diesel fuel, the clang of trays, the sweet relief of cocoa distributed after long watches. These moments of routine anchored the sailors, proof that behind the roaring engines they were still human beings. The Essex class demanded immense labor below decks. Boiler rooms roared with heat reaching 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Black and white photos show men stripped to undershirts, sweat pouring as they shoveled coal or adjusted valves. Flight deck crews faced different hazards. Salt spray and wind so strong it tore gloves from hands. Yet even there, sailors carved out humanity. Chaplain logs describe Sunday hymns sung beside torpedo racks, voices competing with the whine of turbines. One prayer noted simply, "We ask for mercy in the machine." Contrast lived ashore in the prisoner of war camps. Japanese sailors captured after the Philippine Sea found themselves on American soil, sometimes housed near farms or factories. Reports from Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, list 3,200 Japanese prisoners in 1944, many assigned to agricultural labor. They weeded rows, repaired barns, even milked cows. Farmers later recalled the surprise of hearing them sing work songs in the fields, voices soft under the prairie wind. In those spaces, ideology cracked. Enemies became men with calloused hands and tired eyes. Factories, too, bore this duality of industry and humanity. In Brooklyn Navy Yard, welders scribbled chalk notes on steel bulkheads, "Hello from Brooklyn" or "Beat the Japs." These graffiti, often hidden under layers of paint, reminded crews that their ships had roots in ordinary neighborhoods. Oral histories tell of sailors discovering those markings months later, smiling as they realized strangers back home had sent them silent encouragement. The Essex hulls were steel, but their spirit was ink, chalk, and sweat. Every 250 words a new tension emerges. For sailors, it was the battle between fatigue and resolve. Naval medical logs recorded that men aboard USS Lexington averaged only 5 hours of sleep per day during combat cruises. Yet they endured, sustained not just by rations but by small tokens, letters smelling faintly of home, a harmonica tune drifting through the passageways, or the sight of Christmas trees improvised from painted crates. Humanity found its way even into the most mechanized environment. The Japanese Navy struggled to maintain similar morale. Survivors from the carrier Taiho, interrogated after the war, admitted that rations often degraded into moldy rice and canned fish. One recalled the humiliation of seeing American prisoners eat better food than frontline Japanese sailors. It was not simply defeat in combat, but defeat in sustenance. The Essex crews dined on powdered milk, fresh bread from shipboard ovens, even occasional ice cream churned on deck. Not luxury, but proof of logistics as strategy. A camera-ready tableau comes from the mess deck of USS Intrepid, sailors in dungarees, heads bowed over trays, steam rising from tin mugs, light from a single bulb, casting shadows on the bulkheads. The grain of the photograph is coarse, the focus shallow, yet it captures the war's essence. Young men sustained by food, fellowship, and faith in the ship beneath them. Farm life at home mirrored this rhythm. Children collected milkweed pods for life jackets, hands sticky with sap. Women planted victory gardens behind white fences. The government urged families to dig for victory, and they did. Rows of beans, carrots, and potatoes that reduced pressure on supply lines. In one letter preserved in the National Archives, a sailor thanked his mother for canning peaches, noting that the jar tasted more of home than any port. That jar had traveled across oceans, tucked inside a crate labeled ship's store. Factories that produced carrier aircraft also drew labor from small towns. Teenagers joined apprenticeship programs, learning to rivet or machine aluminum. One 17-year-old recalled the thrill of seeing his first Hellcat taxi onto an Essex deck, recognizing parts he had drilled months earlier. These human connections formed a web of belonging. From farm to factory to fleet, every hand touched the war. Yet beneath this tapestry lay the cracks in ideology. Japanese propaganda promised invincibility. German broadcasts mocked American decadence. But the sight of Essex carriers multiplying, the taste of rations rich compared to Axis scarcity, and the resilience of crews who prayed, sang, and wrote letters, all chipped away at illusions. Victory did not belong to rhetoric. It belonged to the grind of daily life sustained with dignity. By autumn of 1944, Essex-class carriers had become floating cities. They held bakeries, barbershops, sick bays, and chapels. Photographs show sailors lined for haircuts, newspapers tacked on bulletin boards, even boxing matches staged in the hangar deck. These glimpses of normal life, preserved in coarse-grain images, testify that humanity endured in steel citadels at sea. A diary page, water-stained and almost illegible, was pulled from a drifting lifeboat on June 20, 1944. The Japanese sailor who wrote it had scrawled one line over and over. "Where do they keep coming from?" That refrain echoed like a riddle, for he had just witnessed a horizon filled not with one or two American carriers, but an armada of them. The page ended abruptly, the pencil stroke broken by spray or panic, leaving only that unanswered question. 2 weeks earlier, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese officers had prepared for what they thought would be an even contest. Their intelligence suggested the Americans had perhaps 8, maybe 9 fleet carriers operational in the Pacific. Enough to respect, but not overwhelming. Yet when the lookouts raised their binoculars and scanned the distant haze, they counted masts and island superstructures multiplying like a trick of the eye. One officer, Lieutenant Commander Okumura, wrote in his action log, "Essex class, more than expected." Like iron growing from the ocean, the Essex hulls were supposed to be rare. Instead, they were arriving in packs. To understand the shock, imagine standing on the deck of a destroyer and seeing black columns of smoke curling from dozens of separate task forces. Each group had its own screen of cruisers and destroyers, its own flight deck bristling with Hellcats and Avengers. The Japanese had never faced anything like it. A fleet log recovered later by American analysts recorded the tally. 15 fleet carriers in sight by dusk on June 19th, with 2 more believed close. Numbers that defied doctrine. The Japanese Navy had gambled its pilot corps on the assumption that America could not possibly build so many giants so quickly. The first Essex-class carriers had appeared only in 1943 at Yorktown and Bunker Hill. Their decks were longer, their elevators faster, their hangars reinforced with steel trusses. They carried 90 to 100 planes each, roughly a third more than the older Yorktown class. Quartermaster tallies noted 3,400 tons of aviation fuel loaded aboard USS Lexington from CV-16 in a single replenishment. That amount alone exceeded what some Japanese light carriers carried in total. Every logistical measure showed an imbalance, yet still Japanese officers believed production bottlenecks would slow America down. They were wrong. In the chaos of the Philippine Sea, pilots from USS Enterprise and USS Hornet reported confusion among the Japanese formations. Enemy Zeros tried to mass but met swarms of Hellcats. The infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot saw over 350 Japanese aircraft destroyed in one day. Yet what truly unhinged Japanese staff officers was not just the aerial losses. It was the realization that even if they somehow crippled one Essex, another would simply steam forward to fill the gap. A diary from Petty Officer Taro Ishida, later captured on Guam, confessed, "We fight shadows that become iron. For each we strike. 2 more arrive. Think of the sensory overload, the thunder of twin 5-inch batteries, the constant clatter of anti-aircraft fire, the rolling smell of avgas carried on the wind." Japanese prisoners later told interrogators that the sea seemed alive with machinery. "The ocean hummed," one said, describing the vibration of propellers and turbines that never ceased. In grainy black and white photos from reconnaissance planes, the carriers looked like a parade of black rectangles, their wakes converging into a white lattice across the Pacific surface. By late June, Japanese headquarters tried to reconcile the figures. Admiral Toyoda, reviewing reports, asked bluntly, "How many of these Essex exist?" Staff officers gave estimates ranging from 8 to 12. Within weeks, intelligence intercepts confirmed the number was already beyond 20, and construction lists hinted at more still on the ways. For a navy accustomed to measured parity, it was like discovering the enemy could double pieces on a chessboard at will. Human moments punctuated this revelation. A captured Japanese signalman on Saipan asked his American guard for confirmation. When told the U.S. Navy already had 20 carriers in the Pacific, he shook his head slowly. Impossible. Factories cannot breathe that fast. His disbelief was not defiance, it was despair. He had trusted the Empire's briefings that American industry was decadent and slow. Instead, he was watching his entire worldview collapse alongside his fleet. Every 200 miles, the Americans set up floating logistics lines, oilers, ammunition ships, hospital ships, all shadowing the Essex groups. Pilots who crash-landed were often recovered within hours, patched up and returned to flying. Compare that to Japanese aviators who, once downed, vanished into the sea forever. Navy chaplains recorded prayers of thanks during evening services aboard USS Intrepid, voices carrying over the roar of engines as men realized they were part of something larger than survival. They were part of a machine that could not be stopped. Photographers captured candid images, sailors in stained dungarees napping against torpedo casings, a chief petty officer scribbling letters home beneath the shade of a wing, damage control crews passing buckets along a line, faces blackened by smoke. Each frame showed exhaustion, but also continuity. No matter how hard the day, the flight decks kept launching sorties at dawn. The carriers were not just ships. They were factories of war afloat. And still the Japanese Navy underestimated. Reports from Guam suggested that new Essex hulls were arriving monthly. By August, when USS Ticonderoga joined the fleet, Japanese staff finally admitted to themselves that America's capacity was beyond calculation. "They come from an endless forge," one officer muttered during interrogation after the war. The Essex had become symbols of inevitability, steel proof that the balance of the Pacific had tipped irreversibly. Yet in June 1944, on those chaotic days of the Philippine Sea, that inevitability was only dawning. Japanese sailors peered through smoke and salt spray at wave after wave of American decks. They still hoped faintly for a miracle blow that might halt the tide. But with every horizon scan, the miracle slipped further away. What they did not yet realize was that the true storm had only begun, that 17 more Essex hulls were still to appear before year's end, each one carrying the weight of American industry onto the shifting seas of the Pacific. The diary page ends with a smudge, a line broken mid-word. The unanswered question lingers. Where did they keep coming from? The answer would be revealed not in the open ocean, but in the cavernous assembly halls back in the United States, where sparks flew, riveters hammered, and steel plates met the welder's flame. That is where we turn next. In the cavernous heart of Newport News, the clang of hammers in 1943 was like thunder rolling indoors. Sparks showered the floor as welders cut through steel plate after steel plate, their faces lit in fleeting bursts of orange light. Inside those halls, the true answer to the Japanese sailors' haunting question, "Where do they keep coming from?" was being written in rivets and steel seams. It was not a mystery. It was an industry. The Essex-class carrier was not a miracle of chance. It was a miracle of scale. American planners had envisioned 24 hulls in the class by war's end. By 1944, shipyard logs already listed 17 active, with more sliding down greased ways each month. A hull that might have taken 5 years to complete before the war now reached the fleet in as little as 18 months. Quartermaster tallies at the Bureau of Ships recorded that over 50,000 tons of steel per month were flowing into carrier construction alone. That figure exceeded the entire annual output of some Axis shipyards. Inside Brooklyn Navy Yard, cranes swung overhead like skeletal giants, lowering armored flight deck sections into place. Each piece weighed 45 tons, and yet fit into a precision-cut socket as if it were a child's toy. Workers were not specialists, but ordinary men and women, house painters, carpenters, even college students, trained in crash courses to operate welding torches or riveting guns. Their pace stunned observers. One Navy inspector noted a crew finishing a 200-foot section of hangar framing in 14 hours, work that had once taken 4 days. "They build ships like they bottle soda," a visiting congressman muttered. The numbers were staggering. Each Essex required around 3 million rivets, 300 miles of wiring, and 200,000 gallons of paint. Navy Yard ledgers counted nearly 3,400 separate compartments in every ship. Yet production was not chaotic. Flowcharts pinned on office walls mapped the process like a dance. Keel laid, frames raised, plates welded, island mounted, flight deck sealed. Even during blackouts and ration drills, the work continued. Factory whistles marked shifts at dawn and dusk, echoing across harbor skylines, until even local children could tell the time by them. A camera-ready moment unfolded daily when a new carrier was launched. The crowd would hush as hydraulic blocks released, and 27,000 tons of steel slid into the water, with a roar like thunder meeting surf. Families waved, women in kerchiefs wiped tears from their faces, and cameras caught the bow cutting a foamy path downriver. Photographs from the launch of USS Hancock show a boy perched on his father's shoulders, wide-eyed as if watching a mountain set adrift. The industrial tempo carried a human rhythm too. Workers brought thermos bottles of coffee, swapped sandwiches on lunch breaks, and sang snatches of popular tunes above the grind of machines. A letter from welder Anna Carney to her husband overseas described how her gloves smelled of burnt metal and salt water. But she pressed on because each spark might be the one that keeps him safe. Her words captured the connection between factory floor and flight deck, between rivet and dogfight.